Thank you very much, Natalie, for this warm welcome, and thank you for coming to this talk. Happy Independence Day and happy birthday to Yvier. I already said that on Wednesday, but it's still sort of, 2 days after your birthday. It's still your birthday in the Netherlands. So Natalie already introduced me as a non-lawyer. That's, I think, very important. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a media studies person, which means I know a little bit of everything, but not a lot about one thing. So that will become apparent, I think, in my talk. And I will definitely introduce you to these mystical terms, and I will sort of start with explaining them in a little while, but I would like to start with this little clip. I would like to surprise you, especially the Americans, for whom it is Independence Day today. I would like you to look at this small clip.
There are some ways. There's one of the extensions that they showed in that segment is called disconnect.me. You can install that into a Chrome browser and a few other browsers. That'll show you what's going on, but by and large, it's still very difficult to block those things. There are some initiatives to create a do not track indicator in browsers that will basically say, don't track me. And most of the major web browsers right now do support that, but unfortunately, only about 24 websites support it right now. So while the browsers support it, the trackers themselves aren't really on board just yet.
Tim, is there any movement at this point to regulate the kinds of what they can do with this information and what consumers can see about what's being done with their information?
We're beginning to see that, yeah. In many ways, it's a lot like the creation of the credit reporting bureaus back in the 1970s, where before that, it was very difficult to see what sort of information was being tracked about you and being reported about you if you were filing for a mortgage or for a new job. Right now, there's the beginnings of an effort to create something like that for data brokerage as well, so the information is being tracked about you, because it's very difficult to see what information is being shared about you. You have
Are the
no
companies
way to see
resisting this, by the way?
They're definitely resisting it. They're saying it's going to be too expensive, but again, those are the same things that they were saying back in the 70s about the credit reporting.
All right. Tim Stevens, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
This is, of course, a discussion about basically information influx. And what, for a general audience, this is how the emergence of big data is largely discussed. It's largely discussed in terms of privacy, of consumer protection, and sometimes information or identity theft. So basically, my talk today will not be about privacy and commercialization or consumer protection. Those are issues that I think are very important, and they really need to be addressed extensively. But what I would like to talk about today is the theme of publicness in relation to this ubiquitous availability of large quantities of data. And actually, this is part of my project on social media and the transformation of public space, which is a project I'm doing for the Royal Academy of Science in collaboration with a couple of my colleagues. So, as is apparent from the title of my lecture, I would like to talk about 3 concepts that I would like to define first before I continue to talk about the deeper implications of that. Those terms are datafication, dataism, and dataveillance. Datafication, and I wrote down this definition. It's not my definition. It's actually a definition that it comes from Victor Meyer-Schoenberger and Kenneth Cookier, who wrote sort of a standard popular work on big data. It was published last year. Datafication, they say, is the transformation of everything into quantified metadata, transmitted online through social media and communication platforms, allowing for real-time tracking and predictive analysis. Now, those are, of course, the most important terms. Now, Schoenberger and Cookier present datafication as a paradigm shift. It's somehow like the Industrial Revolution, where new resources can be monetized, and they're intent on explaining how that sort of monetization happens. Datafication is also presented by them as a neutral paradigm. It is a new type of currency, something that helps you buy goods and services, and they actually don't really, they make a distinction between data and metadata, but they also say that metadata are something completely different than data, and that is something I would like to dispute. It's of course about the content and context of messages, but metadata are often dismissed as sort of byproducts of quantify data, like President Obama, who says, we're not listening in on your phone conversations, meaning that we're not eavesdropping on the content of your message, but we're very interested in just the byproduct that you produce, which is the metadata. So I would argue that metadata is not as innocent as it seems. It's a new type of content. And it's a type of content that's presented as traces left behind by people who are moving their informal lives onto digital platforms. So, in fact, those metadata allow for endless combinations, and they also allow for, excuse me, endless tracking and prediction. The next term I would like to introduce, I'll come back to these terms as I talk. The second term I would like to introduce, it's my own term. Datafication comes from Cookier and Schoenberger. Dataism, as I would define it, is two things. It is a collective belief in the quantification and potential tracking of all kinds of human behavior through online media technologies. Now, datafication, the term I just used, has led to dataism, and this sort of logic, it's a belief, but it's also a compelling logic that forms the basis of this belief, and I'm interested in understanding that logic. It's rooted in a number of assumptions and implied premises about the objectivity of data, and that's a kind of objectivity I would like to discuss with you over the next 30 minutes. It's also, secondly, it's an implied trust in the various institutional agents that collect, interpret, and repurpose metadata culled from online platforms. Now, the implied trust, in these various institutional agents means that the belief is carried out by not just corporations, but also government agencies and, for instance, academia. So from all these different institutional agents, we can expect sort of a support for this particular belief, which is dataism. Now, we all have different expectations, regarding how one institution uses data as vis-a-vis another institution. For instance, when your bank uses your bank information, you do not expect them to start, allowing advertising on the basis of your information. Well, a major Dutch bank did just that 2 months ago. So that's a sort of, a breach of trust between you and your institution. When academics help Facebook actually develop, research that helps them to refine emotional manipulation, that's not something you may not expect from academia. So there's a different expectation of trust towards each of these institutions. I will return to that a little later. But there's also an implied trust in the stable boundaries between the state, private, and corporate institutions as intermediaries. In reality, though, those boundaries are becoming more and more permeable. In fact, I think, and I will address this issue later, it may even become completely porous. Last definition I would like to introduce to you is dataveillance, and that I define as a form of continuous surveillance through the analysis of online metadata culled from social media and communication platforms for unstated preset purposes. That's an important part of that definition. The definition comes from Rhetorical in a book that I will talk about a little later. The acceptance of the datafication paradigm and a belief in dataism are, as I argue, necessary conditions for a society to accept dataveillance in general. Now, unlike normal surveillance, surveillance with cameras, for instance, they're usually done for preset purposes, like security, okay? So you put, security cameras in place, and the data are culled for those specific purposes. That is different in dataveillance, because dataveillance has no so-called preset purpose. Data may be culled routinely and then used in totally different contexts. So that's a particular characteristic of dataveillance. For instance, the registration of all of your phone conversations by phone companies. That's the kind of dataveillance that you can expect. Or healthy citizens who are encouraged to routinely measure their vitals, like their blood pressure and all types of other vitals. That can all be part of what I call dataveillance. Now, over the next 30 minutes or so, or a little less, I will be trying to unpack many of these assumptions of datafication and raise I'll raise 7 particular critical interrogation of big data claims. Those interrogations will be epistemological, ontological, but also ideological and ethical. I think it's important to raise all of these issues just to make sure what datafication does and why it is not a neutral term. So basically, I will try to do a rhetorical analysis of the ideology of datafication and also the acceptance of dataveillance as a normal part of everyday life. This is my first thesis statement. Data are not people, people are not their data, and yet people are conceived as data points. Now, understandably, we do not want to see ourselves as bits and bytes. We don't look upon ourselves as bits and bytes. We're flesh and blood. But in a society where people's movements and social lives are increasingly channeled through platforms, all of your lives have been, informal lives especially, have been moved onto formal systems, we begin to understand increasingly people as a set of data points. So an information picture of who you are and what you do exists, increasingly through the systems that we live in and through. So those pictures of data points, they can be frighteningly accurate, but they can also be terribly or frighteningly deceptive, depending on how you look at it. But to think of data points as a mere reflection of people's actions, I think, is a wrong assumption. So, then the next question is, how is that relation between people and data, and how do data points work? Now, the relation between data and people has never been easy. It has always been contentious in a way. And Oscar Wilde in the late 19th century was he once was at a reception where he didn't know anyone, and he talked to people, he shook hands with people he didn't know. And one of these people he didn't know, he said, shook hands and said, "I don't know you, but I know your type." And this is an interesting story, I think. This is what happens all the time. We understand people, not just machines, but we understand people in terms of typecasting, basically deduction and induction. So we use a lot, even if we're unaware of it, we're using a lot of stereotypes, standards about what's normal and what's abnormal behavior, who's behaving in a specific way, and then sort of deducting from that behavior specific things about what people do. Often those standards or stereotypes are implicit, but they tend to be reinforced as we go along, as we invent systems that are meant to understand us as people in datafied environments. Now, another thing that is interesting about big data analysis, and that is very profound in that book about big data I just talked about, is that what we see in big data, what happens is that big data patterns emerge, and that's the way, for instance, Schoenberg and Kukier talk about it. Emerging patterns are, apparently just culled from those big data, as if there were no preset interpretations for understanding what happens in big data. For instance, and this is a recent study I just noticed, mail order shopping data mail order shoppers are more likely to end up in the emergency room. So that's a pattern that emerges from big data in various databases, data sources. Now, of course, mail order shopping, those data may be a proxy for socioeconomic class, and that's the implied interrogation. Of course, that's happening, but it's presented as if there's a sudden pattern of this simple equation. Now, that's what I mean by people who are treated as a set of data points. They behave according to patterns, and those patterns make them predictable. But there's a peculiar logic to predictive analytics. First, it turns people into, people's behavior into aggregate information, and then, by means of constant user feedback, which is, by the way, mediated by algorithms, then this information then is retranslated back into predictable individual behavior, which is in fact saying, this sort of typecasting, induction and deduction is all equated to one and the same thing. So predictive analytics is a new sort of typecasting, but then, much more sophisticated and much more mediated with algorithms that we really, sometimes can't really read. And I picked up the term yesterday. This is a new type of, neo-demographics that I think requires a lot more scrutiny of how people and data relate to each other. So basically how they are co-constructed. Now, the complexity of predictive analytics is no longer rooted in a single database. There's no just one single database or one specific platform that culls them or that assembles them. For that matter, there's endless combination of data sets, that are no longer owned by one specific company or platform. And many of those data are processed by big data companies such as Axiom. Axiom, based in Arkansas, by the way, they have amassed the world's largest commercial database on consumers. And I'm pointing this out to you because many people, and I heard very little in the past 2 days about the institutional status of this, particular institutions like data refineries, as they call themselves. Systematically, Axiom connects private databases to public databases. They serve more than, I think, the database contains information about 500 million active consumers worldwide, and their servers process more than 50 trillion data transactions per year. Now, just in case you're curious, on each of those persons, the individuals they have in their database, they have about, on average, 1,500 data points per person. So that's what an average person consists of. As you may know, but probably are not aware of, Facebook or Axiom is Facebook's most, its closest strategic partner, and their collaboration is actually very interesting as a form of research. Axiom systems are really designed for predictive consumer analytics. What they do is they recognize consumers, they remember their actions, they classify their behaviors, and they influence them with tailored marketing. So that's really the whole range of stuff that they do. To call such systems data refineries, I think, is a clever rhetorical move in itself. What they basically do is they refine what a customer is worth based on their behavior, of course. So to classify, what they do is classify some people as high-value prospects to be offered marketing deals and discounts regularly, but they also dismiss others as low-value individuals who are not worth very much on the consumer market. And this is known in the industry slang as waste. And I would like to point towards Joe Theroux's work, who's done a tremendous, bunch of research in this area, and he very, precisely describes these terms of, industrial waste or data waste. It is in fact a type of data discrimination that very typically or very often reinforces offline economic disparity. So in sum, while people are not their data, they're actually treated as data points, and the algorithmic refining process conducted by Axiom increasingly influences that sort of online social typecasting and behavior. My second point, datafication relies very much on popular metaphors. I already mentioned the data refinery for dissipating its ideology. And one such metaphor, and that's a very extensive, extensive metaphor is data mining, data refineries, raw resources. There's a whole set of terms that come along with the notion of data mining. Now, data mining itself is quite deceiving, of course, in that it assumes data to be raw resources. And the authors of Big Data, of the book, they claim that, and now I quote, that each data set is likely to have some intrinsic, hidden, not yet unearthed value. And companies are basically engaged in a race to discover how to capture and rate this value. But it's undiscovered. So it's really, that's what the metaphor does. It really defines what your, non-metaphorical world looks like. Now, datafication itself, as a paradigm, it thrives on the assumption that gathering data happens without a set purpose in mind. There's no preset purpose. But data, of course, are never raw, and Lisa Gietelman wrote an interesting book on that notion, and it's called Raw Data is an Oxymoron. And that Rita Rayleigh's article is from that particular book. So data are basically culled from platforms where information is already solicited through specific features, and it's solicited on the basis of specific parameters. In that respect, no platform is neutral. Algorithms already determine what data are culled for what purposes. For instance, Twitter's trending topics or Facebook's news feeds, the selection of what items exactly appear in your news feed or in Twitter's trending topics is already customized by Facebook's algorithms. So they're never neutral, they're culled for specific purposes, but then repurposed. Twitter, though, is often presented and deployed as a sensor, and they call it a sensor not just for public emotions, but for moods or trends, and what we have learned to call it sentiment analysis, as if moods created by Twitter or by Facebook were in fact sentiments that you can basically measure. And this, it goes from measuring public opinions to flu symptoms and everything that you can actually turn into data points. But Twitter, of course, is not a polling instrument, which can be used to predict, voting outcomes. For one thing, if you think about tweets, they come from a specific population demographic. And in the Netherlands, only 15% of people are using Twitter actively. And this is overwhelmingly, done in one age group. So it's not a representative demographic. Nevertheless, Twitter, but also, you can say that for mobile phone messages, all kinds of chat messages, they're often used by, also interestingly, not just by commercial institutions, but also by nonprofits. And oftentimes nonprofits use it as, instead of public services, to replace statistical survey methods, which is an interesting phenomenon. Global Pulse, I don't know if you know this institution, it's a nonprofit, it's a UN-based initiative. They use phone message services, or they use a lot of data coming from phone message services in Africa to measure digital smoke signals of distress, as they call it. And they do that specifically in developing nations in Africa. Now, of course, it fills a gap in those countries that lack a very strong public service, and they have no reliable statistics. But sentiment analysis is also performed to, for instance, for people to predict the price of rice, but also to measure unemployment and also to trace symptoms of disease, of contagious disease. So it's used for a lot of purposes. There may come, very interesting applications may come out of those, of this sentiment analysis, but it's still a mistake to assume that these data are simply raw resources. And in fact, to dismiss the provenance of these data as irrelevant, that would be a serious mistake. What is also a serious mistake is that, the repurposing of data is never neutral. It's not just happening for, whatever. You have to take into account the provenance of data and also look at the repurposing of data. For instance, the flu symptoms and that I just talked about, which are measured through Twitter, they may be used in the same instrument, by the same token, to sell cough syrup to all those people who were actually measured. So what I'm arguing is that's always important to ask questions about data's provenance, about data's history, and also about its future. Where do they come from? For whom are they repurposed? My third thesis is that life mining or reality mining entails a slippery slope between measuring, interpreting, predicting, and intervening in online human behavior. Now, life mining, of course, takes place in real time, while people are living their lives. And a big data mindset, that presumption it often presumes the activities of measuring, interpreting, projecting, intervening to happen simultaneously. But that, of course, poses a serious epistemological problem. What is measurement and what just is intervention? This is something we need to ask ourselves constantly. It is, in fact, in that respect, a small step from life mining to dataveillance. And of course, now, I think I'm about the 10th person here on this stage who returns to that issue, but a few days ago, when the newspapers reported about Facebook's experiments to manipulate the news feeds, over 500,000 people, users of Facebook, were randomly selected to change the number of positive and negative posts they saw. And the interesting thing there is we've talked a lot about Facebook and how they use those numbers, but it was part of a psychological study led by researchers from Princeton and Cornell to examine how emotions can be spread through social media. They call that emotional contagion. That's a study by a serious study by academic researchers. It is an example of how sentiment analysis becomes the equivalent of sentiment manipulation. There is really no longer a difference between what we track and what we interpret and how we manipulate it. But another problem that I think hasn't been raised in this context is the slippery slope that I pointed out, more epistemologically, is also ethical. Facebook has expanded what it's called its data science team. This study was performed by Facebook's data science team to conduct a larger number of what it calls, this is an interesting term, public studies. That Facebook does public studies. And I picked this up from their website. Facebook says their team's mission, that data science team, their mission is to alter our understanding of human psychology and communication by studying the world's largest meeting place. Now, that's an interesting definition. Not only is Facebook presenting itself as an academic institution that studies communication and psychology, but it also pushes the premise that Facebook is the world's largest meeting place, which I think is an interesting way of pushing your own private space as a public sphere. I think that's a very questionable assumption that any self-respecting academic should be suspicious of. If online life is presented as an ongoing and controlled experiment where Facebook comes to stand in for social life, I don't know exactly, how researchers go about that, but I would be very doubtful of the fact that Facebook is now the social place where we live. It's a very specific platform with technological, assumptions built in that wants us to behave in a certain way. And that's of course, the sort of controlled environment that we're supposed to act upon. Compounding this problem, of ethical and epistemological presumptions is that certain normative premises are already inscribed in the instruments that gather these data. So Facebook newsfeed is an obvious example, but a platform like Foursquare, it doesn't simply track your movements. Its algorithms actively, and that's built into the mechanism, they connect you to restaurants, to stores, to lodging, and so that's already built into the hardware. So habitual behavioral analytics and manipulation is inscribed in hardware, in software, in algorithms, in tools that are increasingly closed and proprietary. That's what Yochai Benkler pointed out on Wednesday. I think that's a very important thing to take away, that most of this hardware is already inscribed with many of these assumptions, and it's proprietary software or hardware. One example I would like to point out in this respect is health tracking tools. They're designed for and used by very normal, healthy people. They're not ill usually, but they are monitoring their own eating habits, their calorie intake, and their vitals during exercise. So I just read this article, which I thought raised the interesting question: aren't those instruments not doing more harm than good? Of course, they may improve your health. They may, help you doing more exercise and live healthier. But what looks like medical monitoring instrument is not seldom disguised as a commercial product, and which has other services attached to it that are promoted by the pharmaceutical or health tech industry. My fourth thesis. People tend to trust, now I get to the issue of trust, they tend to trust the independence, it's Independence Day today, data processing institutions, as well as the objectivity and integrity of their methods. People have a high level of trust in data in companies, which I call all of them data companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and most of them do not read the terms of use before they go onto one of their platforms. They basically sign away their rights and they sign away their data to third-party users. Now, that's not the only thing they do. Users also tend to trust government agencies with their data. And of course, interestingly, they also trust academics or health professionals who use those data to perform large-scale research and analysis. But all of these institutions gather data and they cull data from our personal lives, but for each of those institutions, there are different expectations of objectivity and integrity. In general, 90%, 95% of the people really trust their institutions and trust their methods. They stand for something. That's what we call institutional trust. And of course, as I already mentioned, the expectations of trust are different for companies like Google and Twitter than they are for academic researchers. The problem, though, is that academics are increasingly dependent on commercial data companies for gaining access to large data sets, which they need for their research and which they need to pay for because it's proprietary resource. And those academic and commercial data sets are becoming more and more intertwined to a point where you can hardly tell which data set is coming from which kind of provenance. So the whole idea of objectivity and partiality is really problematic in this respect. And I think the most interesting example of that, I come back to health statistics a lot, but an interesting example is a site that you may not know, if maybe some of you know it, Patients Like Me. Any of you who know this site? Have you heard of it? Very few people. It's based in America. It's a website for sharing personal experiences of people who are suffering from the same disease. So there's all kinds of patients groups that exchange stories, narratives really about ALS, for instance, about AIDS or multiple sclerosis, breast cancer. For each disease, there's a separate a separate group. It was started, interestingly, in 2004 by two brothers who suffered from ALS. And those brothers sort of built on the website after their brother died. And what they do on that site is users exchanged very detailed information about their chronic disease. So it's all very structured, the information that you give, but a lot of it is in forms of narratives. And so the kind of narratives they share is, the effectiveness of treatment and the way, they cope with their disease, but a lot of sort of experiential data are expressed in narrative terms. Now, 10 years later, this site was started in 2004, but 10 years later, Patients Like Me has become a for-profit site. And the way it makes money is by giving away pharmaceutical companies paid access to those self-reported health narratives. They also allow them, of course, in exchange for money, they allow them to recruit user patients for clinical trials. Now, the owners of the site still, and they've done this from the beginning, they present their product as the ultimate public good. self-reported health data, they serve as public records. And those public records are presented as akin to flu statistics or license plate numbers. It's public knowledge, except for that you have to pay to get access, and to pay for the processed narratives. Now, patients like me, and this makes it more interesting but also more murky, is that they collaborate with, for instance, clinicaltrials.gov, which is an open source research database. And it's almost impossible to tell which data are used for what purposes or serving what interests. And as you can read, and these are just two of many, many, I've looked them up, I tried to sort of make a cloud of all the kinds of data sets that I could find on self-reported patient data. There are so many I lost track. Sites like Cure Together, 23andMe, they're probably the most famous one. It becomes very difficult to understand their specific business models, and it's even more unclear where they get their data from. Very often, their preset goal, if you can call it that, is vaguely described as advancing people's health. But that's, about the most you find out about their preset purpose. Now, trust, as you probably agree, trust in health data is extremely important, but institutional markers of trust are quickly eroding. So, I often, when I look at these sites, I think, what institutions are behind these sites? What are their methods? How do they use self-reported data and metadata? And how, for one thing, are they repurposed, used for other purposes? That brings me to my fifth point, and I'm getting close to number 7. The boundaries between governments, corporations, and scientists, of course, they have distinctive but also and shared interest in dataveillance. But what's at stake here is the credibility of the system. Now, these boundaries that I just talked about, they're becoming increasingly fuzzy. Who owns those data? Who gives access to which data? And it's interesting, after the Snowden revelations last year, it became clear that governments and corporations are very often collaborators. Google and Microsoft, they pursue communal projects with the NSA. They exchange employees. Edward Snowden himself was an employee of the NSA and then he became a Booz Allen contractor. But nevertheless, after Snowden revealed his knowledge, after he became a whistleblower, Google, Yahoo, and a number of others, they sued the NSA mainly to prove their independence and integrity to consumers and investors. So that was an important point they were making. They were independent from those companies that they constantly collaborate with. The point is that all these institutions, and that we should acknowledge, all these institutions are intricately intertwined in what I've called the ecosystem of connective platforms. What is at stake here is not the credibility of a single company or a single platform or a single government agency. It is the credibility of the whole system. And perhaps it's a little innocuous to make this comparison, but the financial institutions in 2008, before they collapsed, people had a lot of trust in banks as institutions. But the system, everyone, after 2008, everyone was pointing fingers at regulators, at single banks, governments, etc. But in fact, what happened is that people lost trust in the entire system. The whole system had become too complex, too fuzzy, too unregulated, and especially too high-tech. So that, I think, is, that may be sort of a presumptuous comparison, but nevertheless, I would like to point that out. Now, the boundaries between private and public sectors and those communities, they're increasingly blurred. Public tasks that were once performed, by government institutions are now increasingly outsourced to web-based platforms. You may laugh about of course, the Photoshop picture on the left. But in fact, citizens feel empowered by these social media, to participate in, a number of public tasks that they wouldn't think of before. But the site Reddit, for instance, not Facebook, I'll use Reddit this time, it played a very dubious role in hunting down the perpetrators of the Boston Marathon bombing. They tracked down the wrong suspect, and he turned out to have committed suicide. So that was a very tragic, a tragedy in which Reddit played a big role. Now, many of those public institutions, and I know this from the research that I'm doing, they're wrestling with the question of how to cope with those techno-commercial mechanisms of social platforms that channel those large flows of information. And an interesting example, this is an American example, is mugshots.com. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but what they do is mugshots is public information, right? The police, routinely makes a mugshot of suspects, and what this site does, it publishes pictures of defendants who haven't even been tried, and their business model is to remove a mugshot for $400 if you ask them to. So it's using public information, turns it into a private company, and then you have to pay for removing your public information. Once again, what's at stake here is not, one platform or one thing. It's the credibility of the system in which commercial, state, public interests are, becoming increasingly intertwined and very hard to discern. Brings me to my 6th point. The goals of dataveillance, they're never self-evident. Public trust requires transparent regulation. Now, of course they're never self-evident. Ubiquitous data gathering, though, is often presented as harmless. Can't do any harm, so why wouldn't we do this? I think Google Street View is a case in point. Google simply photographed all streets without asking anyone for permission. But Google, in fact, what it does is pushing for total transparency of public and private spaces alike. Now, the legal skirmishes that followed, they were actually futile in comparison to the enormous impact of this type of dataveillance. And of course, some of these legal skirmishes, they resulted in Google removing or sort of blurring a few hundred dots in those zillions of information points. But the fact is that regulation is often hopelessly behind, and companies, they actually, they're very actively trying to work against any kind of regulatory efforts, because what they consider regulation to be a big hurdle to business and profit. So, well, this may not surprise you, but Google is now the single biggest lobbyist in Washington. But in fact, what it does, it fights regulation on all levels, on city level, state level, national, and also transnational. So Professor Benkler noticed in his talk on Wednesday that most of that regulation dates from the 1970s, and it no longer applies to that whole cultural and technological framing of the current networked society. Now, my thesis is, my argument is that public trust requires regulation. I think, regulation in terms of protecting public trust should again become a priority. So we hear a lot of arguments in favor of making room for digital platforms to allow for grassroots initiatives and the sharing economy. But what I find problematic in these calls to arms is that they're presented as public interests. Now, that's an interesting move. A lot of commercial, data companies present their interest as a public interest. This is an example of how they do that. Sharing, this is a site that, Airbnb, I should tell this story first. Airbnb has now become a site for, a global corporation. It's valued at $10 billion, so it is a global corporation. They put up a fight against the New York State Supreme Court just last year. And they demanded the New York Supreme Court, of course, demanded their compliance with safety and tax laws. Airbnb defended their interests, and this is from their website, for the people, by the people, and of the people. Now, Airbnb, Uber, and TaskRabbit, who are sort of similar sharing economy sites, they founded a non-profit lobbying group. It's called Peers. And this group is actually, founded to fight regulation at any level. Peers, not surprisingly, is funded by Silicon Valley money. But what is interesting to me is that the ideological story constructed here by Peers is a story about non-profit groups, Peers is a non-profit, rallying against government regulators with the support of big business to protect the public interests. But what actually is the public interests on the social web? There are really big, I think there are very big interests behind big data, but regulation often gets squeezed in that fight for public trust. By the same token, though, governments and state agencies, they push the norm that giving away private information, private data, is a public duty. You know, this may be a joke, of course, your country needs your personal data, but in the name of security, in the name of protection, or you know, your security at airports for tax purposes, citizens are called upon to give away their data constantly. And that is, for me at least, a contract, an unwritten contract that's cemented in public trust. For me, that relation between me and the government is one that is heavily invested in a public trust. Now, I come back to my understanding of dataism, which is a belief and trust in the power that regulated data-based sociality. But it's also a condition for dataveillance to work. So the acceptance of this particular paradigm, it requires the gullibility of citizens and a high level of trust in the institutions that actually process those data. Now, there's an interesting paradox. Corporations distrust public institutions to take care of regulation. You know, those regulating efforts are often regarded as censorship by the corporations or hampering growth and profit, whereas users are asked to unconditionally trust corporations carrying mantras such as "don't be evil," right? So this is like a strange circular paradoxical logic. Now, what I think is that the core of the problem of the paradox is that public values are no longer rooted in public institutions. So what we've seen over, and that's not just from the last 10 years, but 20 or 30 years, deinstitutionalization, deregulation, globalization, they have really caused the erosion of what public value is all about. So whom do we turn to? You know, when national regulations no longer apply in this global data flow of data exchange, there are very few transnational courts, and the EU, I think, is probably the toughest gatekeeper, but even the EU, as we've heard, I think yours was the one who pointed it out yesterday, it's not really, you know, it's more, it could do a lot more than it actually does. In sum, what I question here is, you know, that the question of publicness is at least as important as the question of privacy in terms of data surveillance. And I think, and I regret that public institutions are alarmingly unprepared for the questions raised by this global information influx. Now I come to my last point, and this brings me to, you know, sort of one conclusion that it's a very shallow conclusion, I admit, but I have to do a lot of research, so I have to come up with something while I'm at it. Datafication, dataism, and dataveillance require critical integration from collaborating scholars. And there are many questions to pose in this context of big data. Where do they come from? You know, why do we look for certain patterns in certain data? All the kind of questions that I just raised. For what purpose are they used, etc., etc. But what was really needed, I think, and that is something that I'm trying to, you know, get across, is what's needed is the development of a reflexive analytical model that looks at the networked public sphere and the ecosystem of connective media in its entirety. Now, that's not, you know, just, we should, this is a model that I used in my last book, The Culture of Connectivity, that tries to look at platforms and the connective media ecosystem as a complex knot of not just legal systems, business models, and algorithms, but, you know, it's a knot where a lot of various disciplinary perspectives come together. What we need really is to learn how to ask questions and that dig deeper than just the relationship between data and people. You know, those kind of questions are also ideological, they're ethical, you know, there are a number of questions that we should try to integrate. And as I think Benkler already pointed out, there are no easy answers to those questions. The ecosystem of connective media and big data infrastructures has become so complex, I just pointed that out, both technologically and economically, that most scholars lack the oversight and the academic fluency to talk in all these expert discourses, and also to look at the grand picture. So I think one of the challenges that we're at is that we really need to look for other ways of, critical thinking. And that needs to be embedded in a curriculum that's not used to sort of, exchange expertise and knowledge from a variety of disciplines. So, in fact, what we need to do is teach technology as ideology, but also business models as techno-commercial engines. And that may, of course, require engineers, they need to be instructed in philosophy, or philosophers perhaps need to be taught coding. I don't know. Lawyers may need to be more interested in business models. There's lots of ways you can actually, implement that. So, in my opinion, critical thinking is the enemy of dataism. So it really goes beyond those issues of consumer protection and privacy that was illustrated in that CBS clip, in CBS this morning. Critical thinking, I think, requires an educational investment in understanding how systems work and how they're designed in the way they are. So if we talk about an information influx, I think there's a lot, that's ahead of us and that we should be aware of. And education, I think, is, a starting point for tackling those issues. And now I think I'm 5 minutes between you and the coffee, but I hope there's a little time for questions. If only just a few, I leave that to Natalie.
Thank you very much, José. That was very, very fascinating, and also pointing out the different players that are involved behind these dataism and data surveillance. So we suggest take 2 very brief questions and then move the questions to a very brief coffee break. Is that okay before we start? But before that, I would like to give some sort of general information for you. So we have now 2 questions, then we grab a cup of coffee, and then we have 3 panels. The one is, and I think you made an excellent introduction into, I think each of these panels will be able to pick on things you said. One is United in Diversity, about the public mission of the archives and public institutions, the media and libraries. The other one is global information flows, again, very related. And the next one is legalizing file sharing. After that, there will be a lunch for everybody with dietary requirements. Please ask the desk. And don't forget the brown bag lunch with job freedom. Only it's a Dutch version of the brown bag lunch. So actually, you would have to pick up lunch here and then take it to the Zwanenzaal. Good. 2 questions. Who's first? There, the gentleman in the back.
I'm Philippe Emma. In 2002, when I was working in the European Commission, one day I received people who were promoting marketing studies platform. Basically, what they had done at the time was they had enrolled 3,000 people in a mid-sized town of France, and divided them into groups of 1,500, equipped them with special TVs and special credit cards, and so one group was receiving some direct marketing spots, and the other one other marketing spots, and they accepted to pay everything they would buy with these special credit cards, and they would receive then something like a 3 or 5% reduction. And when we received these guys, I mean, at first we thought they were joking, and then we, as politely as you must do in the European Commission, we threw them away. And it looked, it looked obviously disgusting, okay? And now exactly the same thing happens all the time. So I really thank you for your talk, because what you are doing is to making evident what has been hidden behind a veil of complexification. So thanks again. So it's really not really a question, but is.
Hey Jose, thanks for that talk. I just noticed on the website of patients like me that they're hiring a data scientist. So if there's anyone in the room looking for a better job with better pay, that's where you need to go. I was very struck by your comparison of the data mining, data broker industry with financial institutions and the collapse of trust and everything. So. The other day, I was part in a session with the director of the NSA compliance office. And as he was talking about their elaborate algorithmic oversight, because they're surveilling on so much that needs to be done through technology, this metaphor or this comparison with financial institutions occurred to me as well. I would love you to expand a bit on that comparison, and maybe you've given it a bit more thought. It was like in a one sentence, but yeah, I'd love you to expand a bit on it.
I thought it was a little contentious because, of course, I don't have anything to, it's just a comparison. But I see a lot of parallels in the fact that, those institutions, they work with, very complex derivative algorithms, that almost no one understood. They were mediated by not just, very, very difficult systems, but also very high-tech platforms. There are a lot of comparisons that between the two that I haven't elaborated upon. It's a little contentious. Of course, I'm provocative. I'm trying to be provocative and elicit comments from people who are not interested in seeing social platforms. They usually see it as something that enlivens their online, their communities, their lives. It's full of sort of a public vigorism, you could say, that I distrust because, so much of it, what's invested in this type of sort of so-called community-based platforms is now infested by very serious economic, institutions. The whole sharing economy euphoria is based on, many of those platforms. And the thing is, I think Yochai Binkler pointed this out on Wednesday too. He said, things like Airbnb, Couchsurfing, and a number of other, which are really community efforts, they're all put on one pile and you can no longer distinguish between what is what. So the whole notion of the sharing economy becomes a quite murky definition of what, what interests were in, what investments are involved in that not of institutional interests, right? So that brought me to the idea to compare it with financial institutions where at the end, in 2008, almost no one actually understood what was happening and almost no one could actually pinpoint their finger at one specific institution. You're right, perhaps I need to elaborate on it, but it's just a hunch. It was meant to be provocative, so.
I see there are many more questions on this room, and we have coffee, so I suggest you take your question to the coffee counter.
I'll be here for questions.
Wonderful.
The remainder of today.
That's great. That's great. So you see, we'll be here the day. So give a huge applause to our keynote speaker.
Thank you for coming.